Hi everyone, I'm Bethany. So this is lecture 3 for Invasion Ecology. Today we're talking about trade and introduction pathways for invasive species. I just want to start with actually an anecdote, which comes from some conversations of folks who work for APHIS, which is the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. That's the main agency that deals with trying to prevent new introductions of invasive species and also inspecting kind of like the pathways of introduction. And APHIS's perspective on this question about invasive species is that introduction pathways and targeting introduction pathways is the #1 highest priority that we should have in terms of stopping future invasions, because that's the only time at which we can successfully stop the whole invasion process. No need to worry about all of those different stages that would come later on because we've essentially nipped it in the bud. We will never know the successes that APHIS is having in terms of stopping pests, pathogen, invasive species introductions because you never hear about those species because they never actually arrive. They never become a problem, which is one of those kind of interesting scenarios where it's hard to document your successes because we only really see the failures. So the reading associated with this introduction pathways is the Hulme paper. So please make sure that you read the Hulme paper and also answer the quiz questions and come with your answers to the beginning of class for that quiz. So pathways from Hulme. So this is just copied out of that Hulme paper. So one of the things that they did that I really like in this paper is they've kind of narrowed down a bunch of different ways by which invasive species are introduced. So not just sort of the vector, like they come in on a boat, and not just the sort of intentional, unintentional, but actually digging a little bit deeper to kind of group things together in terms of, well, what are the different ways of intentional introduction? What are the different ways of unintentional introduction? And the reason that this is important is because you can see on this graph that there are some example regulatory actions that we could take, policy actions that would try to close that pathway, right? So try to stop those invasive species from either unintentionally or intentionally being introduced. And that's why, you know, it's really important to understand these pathways of invasion, because there are different regulatory policy routes that you would take to address them if you know that most invasive insect pests are coming in through this particular pathway. Then you can try to specifically address that pathway and reduce the risk from invasive insect pests. So you are going to be, for your team task #1, which starts next week, you are going to be looking at different taxonomic groups to try to figure out if you agree with Hulme in terms of which taxa have a tendency to come through which of these different pathways. All right, so why are pathways important? Largely because, so this is an image of shipping traffic from 1889. So even in the, 130 years ago, there was already, fairly wide connectivity between different parts of the earth, sort of closing of these geographical barriers that would have historically prevented species from being introduced from one place to another. So that's what it looked like in 1889. Each of those lines is like sort of one shipping route. And this is more recently, so from 2007, global shipping routes. So you can just see from the colors, the yellow colors are more than 5,000 journeys along that route in a given year. So a lot, not only the connection of those disparate areas that historically would have been separated by geography, by these geographic barriers, but a huge magnitude, has increased incredibly over that time period, so that we've got not only the connection but also a large volume of connection. So that was the last one, was shipping traffic. This one is airports, and all of the kind of, so this is in the early 2000s, airport traffic. And the colors that are in sort of like the yellows and the oranges are ones that are like, about the same capacity over a 4-year period. So 2007 to 2010 stayed about the same in terms of their capacity, maybe increased a little bit to like by 5% or something like that. All of those red ones that you see, all across Asia, in parts of Africa, South America, Central America, those are ones that are increasing rapidly. So there's a lot of more connection, not just across the oceans, but across the continents as well. There was this really interesting paper from McCullough that looked at, so if you've traveled internationally and come back into the US, you might have noticed that there is a form that you fill out that says things like, are you carrying fruit or any other kind of organic produce, bulbs, whatever it is? Have you been to a farm? The reason that sheet actually exists, and so any international traveler coming back to the US has to fill out that customs form. And the reason is because there are APHIS, so again, that Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. The USDA actually screens people coming into the US because they're looking for people who might be at higher risk of actually bringing in these commodities that would contain invasive species that we're trying to keep out of the US. So have you been to a farm? Why would people care about that? Well, if you went to a farm, then it's likely that you were tromping around a little bit in sort of dirt or mud, and soils from farms may contain small worms, they may contain insects, they may contain pathogens associated with farm animals that were nearby, and those are all things that the agricultural industry cares about deeply, trying to keep out. This is just a table of APHIS screening from, I can't actually remember, let's see, the time period was 1984 to 2000 from one of these APHIS databases. And basically, there are a lot of things that people are bringing into the US in their luggage. Cut flowers containing insects, fruits containing tons of insects as well as pathogens, bits of plants containing insects and pathogens, weedy seeds, stuff like that. We bring a lot of things in. We had talked, I think in the first lecture, we had some images of vertebrates over time, and a lot of the sort of vertebrate introductions, especially birds and mammals, some of that was sort of looked like it was peaking, in the late 1900s. But that was from one study. This is from another study that suggests that actually the mammal side, at least, has continued to rise through 2000. This is a little bit of an older study. Plants introductions continued to rise through that time period. Invertebrates have spiked, basically. So they've got a, continued to rise, but rising quite a bit in that late 20th century time period. So it's a question of, why do we think invertebrates have been on the rise so much more recently? And I think that the reason behind this is because our mammals and plants mostly have intentional introduction pathway. So we've been, intentionally bringing in animals at an increasing rate, plants at an increasing rate over time, but we kind of like look out for those and are, importing them deliberately. most invertebrates, and here we're talking about aquatic invertebrates as well as terrestrial insects, not an intentional introduction pathway, and so those tend to be tied more directly to trade. So as international trade sort of spiked in the late 20th century, so too did the accidental introduction of these invertebrates hitching a ride along with those commodities, or along with just sort of the stowaways in packing material or something like that. So as trade increases, so does the introduction of non-native species. But there's this interesting pattern to it. So early on, when you just start trading with a new partner, for example, there is a whole new world of non-native species that could come from that trade partnership. You haven't seen any of those species before. They are entirely new, and so you end up with this rapid rise of numbers of non-native species that can be introduced in those early stages of a trade partnership. And then as time goes on, you end up sort of, and all of these, I should say, so mollusks, plant pathogens, and insects, those are all accidental introductions for the most part. We're not real big on deliberately introducing pathogens. Insects are most mollusks. So as time goes on, you start then reintroducing those same species, accidentally over and over again. So the later stages, you end up with this sort of like leveling off, because still increasing, but leveling off a little bit, because it's not this totally new suite coming over, but it's the reintroduction of those same species. And another way to think about this is to break this curve down into this rapid rise where you have totally novel species, and then the more leveling off into propagule pressure. So again, propagule pressure is that idea that we introduce the same species. So a propagule could be a plant part, it could be a pathogen, it could be a plant part containing a pathogen, could be an insect itself, a bunch of insect eggs, however mollusks reproduce, like those things could be floating around in your packing material, in your ballast water, whatever it is. And as you introduce them again and again and again, if the first time, you introduced it and it was winter, and so the thing didn't establish, the second time you introduced it, there was a storm, and so it didn't establish, the third time it got, it didn't make it out of the boat, the fourth time, finally, okay, there it is, now it's been introduced in the summertime, it made it out of the boat, whatever it is. So as you increase the number of as you increase the propagule pressure, that is the number of chances that you have to introduce a thing, the more likely it will eventually succeed in being introduced and becoming established. So in terms of trade, if we want the most bang for our buck in terms of where we want to look for high risk, we actually want the red ones, right? We might not care as much about trade partnerships that have been going on for hundreds of years, because we've seen that suite of species. We kind of know what it looks like. We know what to expect. We can look for specific ones that are a threat from that region. But if we're getting new species from entirely new places, then we don't really know what to look for. And there's a lot of them potentially coming in that we haven't seen before that could establish, and any of which could potentially establish. So this is just a graph, sorry. This is a graph of the early 2000s and nursery plant trade specifically. So nursery plant trade is important in terms of the plants themselves, but also in terms of the plant pathogens and insects that like to hitchhike on those plant imports. So all of the red countries are ones that were developing these new and emerging nursery plant import partnerships with the US. So the US imported, relatively low values of imports at that time, but a really sharp increase in the amount of imports over that time. So the red ones are in that sort of like novel species category, and the blue ones are in we've been trading with those guys for a while. We're still introducing the same things over and over. And this is important because it just sort of makes the case that this is still emerging. We're still creating these new pathways for imports. That means that we're still in the relatively early stages of starting invasions, whether that's in the US or any country of the world. There's so many invasive species around for the most part. And actually, I should say the image behind me is Japanese knotweed. So that one is one that is flowering in generally September. So you might see some Japanese knotweed flowering along the highways as you're driving, or along waterways as you go for walks or hikes. So it may seem like there are lots of invasive species around, but the amount of ongoing trade, and especially trade with new trade partners, suggests that we're still kind of in the early stages. That propagule pressure thing is really important. So this is just an example from a paper that looked at historical sales of plants from nursery catalogs, and then the likelihood relative to the number of sales that species became an escapee, so essentially an invasive species. And what it shows is that the more times it was sold in the 19th century, in these 19th century nursery catalogs, the higher the likelihood that species would be escaped today. And that goes back to this idea of propagule pressure, right? So if you plant it once in somebody in their garden plants it once, and then the species is no longer available for sale, well, that species might die, forget to water it, whatever happens, you just don't have a green thumb. And that species fails to reproduce, and you have, an end to the potential invasion pathway for that species. Whereas if it's sold year after year after year by that nursery catalog, and I plant it again and again and again, even though I keep killing it with my black thumb year after year after year, eventually maybe it survives. Eventually that means like, okay, finally this is a good year for it. Eventually it establishes, then it has those opportunities to spread and go on and become invasive. So propagule pressure really matters. Introduction sources. So plant introduction sources. This is, and then all of this is sort of summarized in the Hulme paper too, but I did want to go over the non-native and invasive plant ones with you. So this is first a table from Mack and Erneberg, and they looked at all of the plant species that were non-native that they could find in these different parts of the world. So Florida, Texas, the Northeast, Rhode Island, New York. And then they dug around to see what they could find about how those plants actually got there. And for these ones, so these are naturalized species. They're not necessarily invasive, so they're not necessarily expanding, spreading, having an impact. They're just part of the flora now of these regions. So upwards of 60% of those species were deliberate. Somewhere around 2 or 3% were seed contaminants, and then a bunch of them, we don't know, possibly with the unknowns, they might be more likely to be contaminants, because otherwise there should be a record of their introduction. So of those, so that Mack and Erneberg is the column on the far left. Those are non-native plants. Of those non-native plants, some portion of them are also invasive, right? So portion of those go on to become invasive. For the invasive plants, we see that they are still more than 50% likely to have been deliberately introduced. But that accidental, that sort of weed seed contaminant pathway becomes more pronounced. For noxious weeds, so this is noxious weeds is kind of like weird category of species that are regulated within the US. So we have a set of species that tends to have more of a slant towards agriculture, and agricultural crops are a good way, good pathway for introduction of weedy species through seed contaminants. So the noxious weed pool has a larger proportion of the accidentally introduced contaminants through seed contaminants, ballast water, other stuff. And then generally, if you are deliberately introduced as an invasive plant, you mostly came as an ornamental plant species, and then there's a few other forage crops or restoration species. So those are common invasive plant introduction sources. Live plant imports also are a major pathway of insects and pathogen contaminants, just like when we were talking about the airplane, baggage introductions. A lot of those plant parts that were found in people's luggage, or fruits or bulbs or whatever they are, contained insects or contained pathogens of some sort. The same is totally true of the live plant introduction pathway. Lots of contaminants, and then so all the green on here are the live plant pathways: sap feeders, foliage feeders, and pathogens, very commonly introduced that way. The other major set of pests, insect pests, that gets introduced are wood feeders, so the Asian longhorn beetles of the world. And those are mostly introduced as stowaways on wood pallets, or wood dunnage is the word for it. So basically, like, slabs of wood that they stick in a boat to keep it from tipping over and stuff like that. Solutions for these sort of release and the escapes, so these deliberate or intentional introductions. One big plus of us knowing the pathways of these deliberate introductions is that you can actually look at the species that are coming in through that pathway and say, this one looks like it's unlikely to have impacts. This one looks like it's more likely to have impacts. So either green or different colors are applied to some of these lists. Probably better terminology is a green list, like a okay to import, versus a red list, not okay to import. And you can do that if you know the identity of the species that are actually being imported. So here's one example of a risk assessment questions associated with importing ornamental plants. And so APHIS, again, that Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, has come up with this list of questions that they can then score to say, well, is this species more similar to other species that we know to be invasive, or less similar to those ones? And if it's more similar, then it's probably higher risk. If it's not that similar to known invasive species, then it's probably low risk and okay to let in. So those were the last slide were some of the questions associated with it. And then they did an assessment and found that, okay, if you do a cutoff of 9 or whatever on their assessment score, then those are the both major and minor invasive species that have a larger impact. And so we should, if a species scores in that like higher risk categories, then we should have them stop, or we should reject that application to import them. And so so that's all kind of hypothetical, right? Like, so the scientists have weighed in on here's how we would do it if we really wanted to prevent invasions. But then science and politics, right, are not always perfectly aligned or even close to aligned. So there is a ruling in the books called the NAPPRA ruling. And NAPPRA stands for Not Authorized Pending Pest Risk Analysis. And so basically, this has been enacted a little bit. It's been enacted for congeneric species of existing invasives. And so congeneric basically means of the same genus. So if you wanted to import, for example, another Fallopia species, so Fallopia is the Japanese knotweed pictured behind me. If you were a plant trade person and you wanted to import another Fallopia, then we know that there's a close relative of it that's a real problem, invasive species, and so that new species that you wanted to introduce should be subject to this evaluation to make sure, like, it's closely related. If it's closely related, it probably has similar traits because it's, close relative on the evolutionary tree. And so we want to make sure, real sure, that it's not going to be a problem like the species that we know about. At this point, that's still a relatively small portion of the overall, numbers of plants that are being introduced, but they continue to kind of work on these regulatory practices to make them more proactive, because more proactive is where you get your best win. And that's what this analysis is. This is one that was done for Australia, basically assessing, it's a model assessment that says, like, over time, so this is an accuracy of your risk assessment. So 100% accurate, is it the right side? 50% accurate means that, about half the time you miss an invasive species and let it in. And then the little colors on here are basically your time frame. So in 100 years, what this says is if you can get an accuracy or a risk assessment that is at least 70% accurate, then in a 100-year time frame, you are going to be saving billions of dollars, Australian dollars. So I don't know, that's less than billions of dollars of US dollars, who knows. Or if you wanted a 50-year time horizon, then to get a payoff, you need an 80% accurate risk assessment so that you're keeping out these things that would eventually come in, cause a bunch of both ecological consequences and economic harm to control them, or direct economic harm, like the loss of trees from an insect pest. Other solutions for these accidental species. So we talked about the deliberate ones with risk assessments, contaminants, hitchhikers and stuff like that. We don't know what the species is. So it's not necessarily that you can look out for or target a specific species. People for the most part are not importing the Asian longhorn beetle. So we can't, stand at the airport and say, clean out your bag, like open your bag, take out the Asian longhorn beetles, right? Like that's not a thing. The Asian longhorn beetles are coming in through wood shipments mostly. So how do we stop that? One way is to have better protocols for the cleaning of wood pallets. So you can heat them to high enough temperature to kill wood-boring insects. You can treat them with chemicals and stuff like that. You can use plastic pallets instead, but those last two especially have other environmental consequences. Once the Asian longhorn beetle or whatever your wood-boring insect has arrived, you can try to contain the spread of that species by campaigns such as Don't Move Firewood, right? So I remember, this is probably like 10 years ago, my parents come from Arizona. We were driving, I picked them up at the airport and we were driving up to Massachusetts, and there was a sign that said, no firewood, no Connecticut firewood allowed in Massachusetts. And my dad was, like why can't you take firewood from Connecticut to Massachusetts? What a stupid thing to have on a sign on the highway. And I was like, well, actually, it turns out that they're trying to control the spread of these wood-boring insects, and that these can damage entire ecosystems. And certainly when you're in a northern temperate forest, loss of tree species is a major deal around here. Stopping Aquatic Hitchhikers is another campaign which is basically focused on the boating community to try to reduce things like that zebra mussel being introduced, a lot of floating aquatic plants, certainly aquatic invertebrates that might stick to the back of your boat. And so as more and more lakes that specialize in recreation have figured out that, like, if invasive species get in here, then that really destroys the character of the both the recreation and the ecosystem. More and more of those lakes have put up these, public campaigns to try to prevent people from introducing them. Here's another example of an invasive species that has a real clear link to a contaminant pathway. And I would invite you to go on, you're already on YouTube, go find a YouTube video of the sound of a coqui frog, because they are super loud and really interesting to listen to. It's a tiny frog. It's native to Puerto Rico. It is invasive in Hawaii, and I guess it's now becoming invasive in California as well. Introduced as a contaminant or hitchhiker on nursery plants that were brought from, grown in Puerto Rico or grown in Florida, and shipped over to Hawaii or to other parts of the world. So tropical frog. Turns out there's actually a really easy solution to dealing with coqui frogs, which is to spray nursery plants with sort of a low solution of lemon juice. That'll kill the frogs, but keep the plants alive for the most part. And the challenge here is, how do we get the nursery industry to implement this type of solution? Like, it's actually a pretty simple solution, but there's no incentive or disincentive. Like, it's not a crime to introduce a plant that has coqui frogs on it. But it's a real problem for people who live near those infestations. In some parts of Hawaii, they say that the housing prices are actually going down because of the noise of that these things make in the evenings. Makes people not want to live there. So this is a question for policy, a question for regulation of how do you encourage an industry to do what's in the best interest of the commons, even if it takes extra effort and dollars on their part. So different solutions for contaminants are to increase the regulation and laws, basically allowing for inspection and quarantine of different commodities that are coming in, these commodities that we know are direct pathways, like the ornamental plant trade. Another way is to basically tax the pathways, tax the ones who are most responsible for bringing in these invasive species. So if they are industries that deliberately focus on bringing in, novel species to the US, like the ornamental plant trade, like the pet trade, are both really good examples of that, and that action leads to invasions, then there should be some tax on those imports that could then be used to manage those invasive species later on. Taxes, whether that's cap and trade, so maybe by having these good actions like spraying your plants to kill the coqui frog, you get some sort of credit towards whatever it is, lower taxes or something like that. And just to make the point that invasive species are a problem of environmental commons. And that means that there are a few sectors, individuals who benefit from introducing species that can go on to be invasive. And it's the larger environment, and to some degree the economy that ends up suffering. So that means that there's not necessarily an actor pushing back, right? There isn't the, native forest, eco-forest trees are not saying, stop introducing all of this wood packing material because the Asian longhorn beetle is coming, right? So that means that we as a country, as citizens, need to be pushing for better regulation, better laws that will prevent invasive species introductions or create more incentives for those people who engage in trade and to act in a less risky manner. So one last kind of point on here is that there's a lot of threat basically associated with the introduction of non-native species. And the sort of panel B on the left side is lots of parts of the world, the red is higher risk associated with lots of seaports, lots of volume of either airports or your country imports a lot of goods, lots of volume coming in of either animal or plant or both imports coming in. So pretty high threat in large areas of the world. And then the challenge is that we tend to be very reactive in our regulations. So the capacity shortfalls, I guess, are the ones to look at. So B and D over here. Redder areas are ones where we're really falling behind in terms of our ability to regulate or to stop these new species coming in. So we're not, so proactive regulation would be something like, having those weed risk assessments to prevent specific species from coming in, or having a border inspection, looking out for species coming through a specific pathway. Reactive regulations are things like, okay, the species is already here, now we're going to go out and try to manage it, or having a list of species that are like invasive in your country or jurisdiction or state or whatever, so that managers know which ones to look out for or monitor for. But at that point, the species is already there. It's kind of too late to prevent. It's too late to prevent the introduction, right? So the more productive regulation is to prevent the introduction before it happens, the proactive regulations. And unfortunately, so this is from a paper by Early and others in 2016, when we looked at all of that regulation, it was mostly on the how are we going to manage it once it's here side, and not so much on the how do we prevent it from getting here in the first place. So as a global society, we've got a lot of work to do on the regulatory side. All right, so just a reminder that the reading for this week is the Hulme et al. Paper, so make sure you do that reading to accompany this lecture and come with your answers to the quiz questions